Dean, there's great dispute about what consciousness is, and what's fascinating to me is that very smart people are at really extreme positions. On the one hand, many say that consciousness is an illusion, just the pure product of the physical brain, and there's nothing, really no problem to be explained at all. Some would have consciousness being the most fundamental thing in the universe. From your work in ESP and your thinking about it, trained as a scientist, how do you view consciousness in terms of its ultimate reality?
The thing which has really pushed me on coming to the conclusion that panpsychism seems to be right is not so much because I come from a philosophical tradition, because I really don't. I mean, I know a little bit about the mind-body problem as discussed by philosophers, but I'm coming at it from an empirical point of view. There is evidence that intention affects the physical world. So now you start thinking in the usual way that the physical scientists would. Well, what are the force beams coming out of the head? We don't see any beams coming out. In fact, even the evidence doesn't exactly look like it's a causal mechanism. There are weird relationships that arise. So how can that be if it's some kind of a downwards causation effect? You know, my mind sort of rippling down into the world. I suppose that's possible. But it just seems to make more sense if really at the bottom, we're talking about consciousness, or some kind of ocean of consciousness. And when that gives rise to an emergent property, we might call it energy, and that gives rise to matter, and then the physical world plays out in the way that we usually see it, except that really at the bottom is consciousness.
And so the implications of that is that if consciousness is the most fundamental thing, and then out of that comes energy matter, and out of that comes the macroscopic world as we see it, and out of that comes the consciousness that's in our mind, somehow that circles around and is in touch with this broad consciousness base. So it's not such an unusual separate energy transfer, it's really coming back home.
Well, it's not so much that there's like a layer cake. There's a layer cake of consciousness and a layer cake. It's really all one thing. It's a big spectrum. So if in thinking then, well, how could mind affect matter? It's much, much easier for me to simply imagine that if matter is ultimately composed of mind, then when mind goes tweak, the matter has to go twang in some way because it's ultimately the same thing.
Now, you're not a so-called idealist, which says that consciousness is the only thing that exists and everything else is an illusion. You're not saying that.
I wouldn't say that. No, I would say that it's useful to think of this as a layer cake, but really it's some kind of a spectrum. It's a spectrum of what we might say from the high part of the spectrum, that everything is material, is hard matter, hard stuff that becomes progressively more refined as you go further down.
Well, certainly we now know, the last century through Einstein, that matter and energy are equivalent. We know that for sure. Mm-hmm. And that before then, that would seem like a very strange thing. Matter is something that's tangible and energy is not. You can't hold it. But now we know that they're the same thing. Mm-hmm. And do you see the step of consciousness being the composition of both being on that same scale, only at a different level, or something radically different?
No, it actually makes a lot of sense to be on that same scale, because if you think of it as a spectrum of matter, another form of it is energy, and from quantum mechanics, another form is information. Mm-hmm. Well, what's information? That sounds a lot like mind stuff. So I'm not very comfortable with the word consciousness because it's almost too big, so I'll use mind stuff instead. So there's now we're talking about a 4-layer cake: mind stuff, information, energy, and matter, all part of one spectrum.
And what are the implications of that, if that's true? I mean that's a radical departure from traditional thinking.
Well, among other things, if it's true, then ESP almost certainly must exist. In other words, if you accept this as a theoretical construct, then suddenly ESP becomes much, much easier to accept, I think, especially psychokinetic effects. Because if your intentions are somehow down at the bottom level, and your intentions move a little bit, and as the fundamental base, they should ripple all the way up. Exactly how they ripple and all the rest of it, we don't know, but just theoretically, it should be deeply entwined in some way.
It's a little scary.
Well, not if that's the way it is, you know. So I actually don't see it as scary at all. I see it as kind of exciting.
Well, it certainly it certainly would indicate that, you know, if you think bad thoughts about something, and you know that could be real. I mean, that's what you're implying.
Some of the evidence suggests that your thoughts will make an impact on another person's body. There's a large literature of this, published actually in mainstream journals. So, yeah. So we should be mindful of our thoughts.